I'm going to create a new trigger on the case object and call it check secret information. When it's time to evaluate when our trigger should run, it should definitely run when a case is created, and it should also run when a case is updated. These are the two scenarios when a case description could be changed. Now, a tough question. Should I use before or after? Well, most of the time we use before, but I know you need to use an after trigger if you need access to system fields like the record ID. Later on, I do see us using the case ID field, since we'll need to create a child case that associates with the original case, and that requires a case ID. So we'll change this to after insert. We don't need to change this to after update, since if a case is getting updated, it already has an ID beforehand. It only doesn't have an ID before it's inserted, so I can leave this as before update. If you're ever on the fence with before or after, just start with before and see if there's a need to change it later. Once again, to boost my confidence, I write out our trigger loop because we always have one. This moment right now is the most important part of coding. Starting off with essentially a blank canvas, how do you take the first steps to writing working code? One trick I do often is I like to write high-level comments on what I'm eventually going to code. This gives me a sense of what I'm trying to do overall, and it saves me from writing in these comments when I'm inevitably going to write them later. I break this trigger down into 3 main steps. The first step is adding all our secret keywords into a collection. The second step is checking to see if our case contains any of the keywords in step 1. And the third step, if our case has a secret keyword in it, create a child case. Breaking down our trigger into these 3 steps makes it seem a lot more manageable. Each of these 3 steps doesn't seem too complicated in itself. If I can separately solve each of these steps, I can definitely solve this trigger. First step, get all our secret keywords in a collection. There are 2 main types of collections, lists, and sets. The former remembers what order our values are in, and the latter doesn't. It won't matter to us what order these keywords are in, so I'm going to go with a set. A list would probably work too, but no use using a tool that's overqualified. First, I create our empty set. Then I add our keywords in one by one. Throughout my life, I've learned an important lesson that a person's body weight is arguably a more guarded secret than their credit card number. So I'm going to add that to the set too. Now I have my set ready to go. But I notice my set is inside the trigger loop, meaning for each case in our trigger, we recreate this exact same set. While this isn't a game-breaking issue, it would be better if we just created this set once and reused it, instead of recreating it for each case. All we have to do is move this code outside of our trigger loop. Code inside our trigger loop will still have access to this set because variable scope tells us that child blocks of code have access to variables in their parent blocks of code. Step 1 is done. Time to move on to step 2. Our goal now is to identify if our case contains any of the keywords we listed above. To do this, we can loop through our secret keyword set and use the contains.notation method against our case description. I'm going to start writing our loop inside the trigger loop, since this is something we need to repeat for each case in our trigger. We're going to use the for each loop, since it easily loops through every record in a collection. In this case, our secret keyword set. This syntax says loop through the secret keyword set, and for each value in that set, temporarily assign it to a string variable called keyword for the duration of the iteration. Great. Now to check to see if our case description contains the particular keyword. We'll use an if statement for this. Our case description is a string data type, and strings have access to a dot notation instance method called contains. You use it by typing dot, contains, and inside the parentheses, the word you want to check. The result is true or false, which is exactly what we need for our if statement clause. Now, what do we put inside this if statement? Well, if our case description does contain a secret keyword, we need to create a child case. I'm tempted to put that child case creation logic inside our if statement, but experience tells me otherwise. One coding concept you'll learn to appreciate is you generally want one block of code to do only one thing. So far, this block of code does one thing really well. Check if our case has a secret keyword in it. If we added more logic to also create a child case, this block of code would be doing two things instead of one. It's better to separate these out into two separate code blocks because it's much easier to read and we can maintain them independently from each other. I don't want to go too much into this right now, especially given our code would work either way, but I'm going to separate this logic nonetheless. To help foster a clean split, I'm going to create a list of cases and call it cases with secret info. In step 2, all I need to do is add our offending cases to this list. Then in step 3, we can loop through this list and handle the child case creation separately. I have to decide where to create the cases with secret info list. We need the info in this list to be preserved even as we loop across every case in our trigger. So we'll create it outside of our trigger loop to preserve its variable scope. By the way, I used a list instead of a set because generally S objects work better in lists. Just take my word for this for now. Back to our original if statement. If our case contains a secret keyword, I add it to our cases with secret info list. At this point, we've probably wrapped up step 2, but I take a moment to see if there are any optimizations I can make before moving on to step 3. Especially when using loops, I like to go through an entire loop scenario in my mind, iteration by iteration, to see if it makes sense. I come up with an interesting scenario. What if our case contains more than one matching keyword? Whether there's one match or all 5, we end up doing the exact same thing. So it makes sense to stop looping through our keywords the moment we found a match. I add the break statement inside our if clause that forces our code to immediately break out of looping across our keywords. Another small optimization I make is to clean up the comments given the structural changes we've made to our trigger. Here's another one. Remember when I said it's common to get null pointer exceptions when using dot notation? Well, when we use the contains dot notation method, we're putting ourselves up to risk to receive the null pointer error. What if our case description is null? To protect against this, I first add a condition that our case description can't be null. I join this with our existing logic using the AND operator. At this point, I'm getting pretty paranoid and I have no idea if any of this actually works. System.debug to the rescue. I'm going to add a debug statement inside our if clause to tell us if we found a match. I like to make my debug statements include a lot of information just in case I need it. So our debug statement will have our case ID and the specific keyword found. One last improvement here. We're using the contains method, but I have no idea if it matches in a case-sensitive way or not. A quick Google search and I find there's a contains ignore case method, which gives me the flexibility I need. Okay, I'm satisfied with step 2. On to step 3, creating our child cases. In step 2, we populated a list of cases that contain secret info. In step 3, we're going to loop across this list and create a child case for each one of them. We'll use a for each loop since we don't need to deal with any iterator variables. We'll use a case with secret info variable for each case in our cases with secret info list. These two may look similar, but the list has an S in it. First, we'll create a new case record. We'll populate its subject. Then we'll set the standard parent ID field of our new case to the original offending case. We'll escalate and set the priority of the case to high. Then finally, we'll add a description that includes all the potential matches found on this case. Adding a collection to a string just like this works beautifully. Finally, we insert the child case. As a habit, I make sure all the equal sign line up vertically. I like to take pride in what I code. I think our trigger is ready to go at this point. I'm always a little nervous around here, but I force myself to continue. I save our trigger and no errors come up.